My sister crashed through our engagement party like a hurricane, screaming that my fiancé was trying to kill me for my inheritance. The entire backyard went silent as she tackled him straight into the dessert table, sending our 3-tier cake flying while she pinned him down next to the chocolate fountain, yelling about poison and life insurance policies. 50 guests stood frozen with champagne glasses in their hands, while my sister held my fiancé's face in the spilled frosting, demanding he confess to what he'd been putting in my food. My mother dropped her phone, trying to call 911, while my father and 3 groomsmen dragged my sister off my fiancé, who was covered in chocolate and screaming that she was insane. The string quartet stopped playing mid-song as my sister broke free from the men holding her and grabbed my dinner plate, shoving it toward the nearest guest while shouting that the salmon was laced with ricin. Everyone was comforting my humiliated fiancé, who was wiping cake from his hair and demanding my sister be arrested for assault, while I stood there in my designer dress, watching my engagement party turn into complete chaos. Check his laptop for the ricin extraction tutorial he downloaded last week. My sister screamed as 2 of my fiancé's friends restrained her arms behind her back. He's been slowly poisoning her with ricin from castor beans for 3 months, building up the doses so her death would look like sudden organ failure right after the wedding, when he becomes the sole beneficiary of her trust fund. Everyone stared at me, standing there in my pink engagement dress, while my sister kept talking fast because she could see my fiancé reaching for his phone to call the police. Look at her weight loss, the stomach cramps she thinks are from stress, the hair falling out that she's been covering with extensions since May when they moved in together, and he started cooking all her meals. My trembling hands went to my thinning hairline that I'd been disguising with expensive salon treatments and clip-in pieces. And my sister continued, pulling out screenshots from her phone that security hadn't confiscated yet. I have photos of his search history showing how to extract ricin, what dosage causes slow organ failure, and how to make it undetectable in blood tests, unless specifically looking for protein synthesis inhibitors. My fiancé tried to stand up from the chocolate-covered patio, but my cousin Jake held him back, though I noticed his grip had changed from supportive to suspicious, as doubt spread across his face. He increased your trust fund beneficiary amount to $8 million last month without telling you, and there's already a flight booked to the Cayman Islands for next week that he claimed was a surprise honeymoon destination. My Aunt Patricia, who worked as a nurse practitioner, stepped toward my dinner plate and carefully smelled the salmon, then immediately backed away, saying it had an unusual bitter almond scent that didn't belong in seafood. More guests started pulling out their phones, Googling ricin poisoning symptoms, and staring at me as they recognized the dramatic weight loss and fatigue I'd been attributing to wedding planning stress for months. My sister managed to access more evidence on her phone, showing bank statements where my fiancé had been researching offshore accounts and studying my family's trust fund structure, learning exactly how much he'd inherit if I died before our first anniversary. But that's not even the worst part, my sister said as my father held her shoulders and her voice cracked with desperation. He gave you a concentrated dose this morning in your coffee, knowing the ricin would cause complete organ failure during tonight's party, to make your death look sudden and natural. And there's no antidote because ricin destroys cells at the molecular level. My sister had discovered everything after breaking into his apartment yesterday and finding his journal documenting every dose he'd given me for 4 months, with notes about my deteriorating health and calculations for the lethal final amount. She'd tried going to the police at midnight, but they said there wasn't enough evidence for an arrest warrant, especially since my fiancé had no criminal record and we appeared to be a happy couple planning our wedding. That's when my sister realized the only way to save me was to disrupt the engagement party before the ricin in my system reached critical levels. And destroying the party was the only way to prevent me from eating the final dose he'd prepared in tonight's dessert, because my fiancé had convinced everyone that my sister was jealous and mentally unstable. The crowd turned to stare at my fiancé, whose expression had shifted from victim to something cold and calculating as he realized his entire plan was exposed to 50 witnesses. 2 groomsmen still held his arms, but he was moving faster than anyone expected for someone who'd just been tackled into a cake table. The gift table was right behind him, and he grabbed the heavy crystal vase we'd received from my grandmother, spinning toward me before anyone could react. His chocolate-covered hands locked around my wrist despite the sticky mess, and the sharp crystal pressed against my neck as he pulled me back against his chest, using me as a human shield. The security guard my father had hired froze with his hand on his radio, and my cousin Jake stepped back with his hands raised. "Nobody move or I'll finish what I started," my fiancé said, his voice different now, cold and methodical, like he was reading from a medical textbook instead of the warm tone I'd fallen in love with. The crystal cut deeper as he dragged me backward toward the garden gate, while 50 people watched in shock. My sister fought against my father's grip and screamed for him to let me go. Her face twisted with pure desperation as she watched the man she'd tried to stop, now using me as a shield. My cousin Jake, who'd been holding my fiancé back, stepped away completely with his hands up, finally understanding he'd been protecting someone who'd been slowly killing me for months. I forced myself to speak even with the crystal digging into my throat and told my fiancé that everyone knew the truth now, so hurting me wouldn't accomplish anything. He pulled me tighter against his sticky shirt and said if he was going down anyway, he might as well collect on the insurance policy, since the ricin was already working through my system, and I'd be dead within hours regardless. My Uncle Robert moved forward with both hands raised like he was approaching a dangerous animal, and asked my fiancé to think about his future and what this would mean for the rest of his life. My fiancé actually laughed, this bitter sound that didn't match the charming man I'd been planning to marry, and said his future was already ruined the moment my sister found his journal. Right then, the string quartet's cello player accidentally knocked over his music stand, sending sheets of music flying across the patio with a loud crash that made everyone flinch, including my fiancé. I drove my elbow back into his ribs as hard as I could and felt his grip loosen just enough for me to drop my full weight down while twisting away from the crystal. The vase caught my shoulder as I fell, and I felt it scrape across my collarbone and tear my dress. But I kept moving, hitting the concrete patio hard while my fiancé lunged after me. 3 men tackled him before he could reach me, and the crystal vase went skittering across the patio as they pinned him down, his chocolate-covered hands leaving sticky prints on the concrete as he fought them. EMTs rushed over to me while the security guard cuffed my fiancé, who was screaming that I deserved this for being too stupid to notice what he'd been doing for 4 months, right under my nose. My sister broke free from my father and dropped to her knees beside me, apologizing over and over for not finding another way to save me, tears mixing with the chocolate smears on her face. The paramedics pressed gauze against my shoulder wound while explaining they needed to get me to the hospital immediately for something called supportive care, since there was no specific antidote for ricin poisoning. My mother collapsed into a patio chair, sobbing, while my father told my sister she'd saved my life, his voice breaking on every word. The EMTs lifted me onto a stretcher and rushed me past all the engagement party guests who were still standing there in shock, past the destroyed dessert table with cake ground into the patio stones, past the champagne glasses abandoned on tables throughout the backyard. In the ambulance, one of the EMTs named Marcus started an IV while explaining that ricin poisoning required immediate hospital monitoring to support my organs as they tried to process the toxin. My whole body was shaking now, but not from fear. It was the poison affecting my nervous system, making my muscles spasm involuntarily. Marcus kept talking in a calm voice about how the hospital would monitor my kidney and liver function. But I could barely focus because my vision kept blurring and my head felt packed with cotton. The ambulance pulled up to the emergency room where Dr. Sarah Chen took over my case immediately. She ordered comprehensive blood work to confirm ricin exposure, while nurses connected me to monitors that started beeping with my vital signs. Dr. Chen explained that ricin attacks cells by stopping protein production, and while there was no antidote, they could support my organs and help my body fight the poison if we'd caught it early enough. The blood draw made me dizzy, and I could see my hands shaking uncontrollably. These violent tremors I couldn't stop no matter how hard I concentrated. Dr. Chen said tremors were common with ricin exposure, and that the shaking would either improve as the toxin cleared my system, or get worse if my organs started failing. My Aunt Patricia arrived with my parents an hour later, immediately questioning Dr. Chen about treatment protocols and prognosis using medical terminology I didn't understand. The door opened and Detective Maria Santos from the county sheriff's office walked in, introducing herself and explaining she was investigating the attempted murder charges against my fiancé. She pulled out a notebook and started writing down everything Dr. Chen told her about ricin exposure and expected symptoms. My mother kept squeezing my hand like she needed physical proof I was still alive. My aunt asked Dr. Chen about something called cytotoxic effects and whether permanent organ damage was likely, using complex medical language that made my head pound worse. Detective Santos said with 50 party guests as witnesses and all the physical evidence my sister found, my fiancé wouldn't be able to claim innocence or accident. She left to collect evidence, but returned 30 minutes later carrying sealed bags containing my dinner plate from the party and samples from the coffee my fiancé had made me that morning. The preliminary test showed significant ricin contamination in both, enough to cause severe illness or death depending on my body weight and exposure time, and she sealed everything for the crime lab's detailed analysis. My sister showed up then with 2 officers, chocolate still smeared on her dress and her knuckles swollen from tackling my fiancé through the dessert table. Detective Santos told the officers to remove her handcuffs because my sister's actions were clearly protective and she'd prevented a murder. They released her on her own recognizance while nurses drew more blood for additional testing. The results came back showing my ricin exposure was significant, but not yet at fatal levels, though Dr. Chen warned that ricin damage was cumulative and my organs were already under stress from months of smaller doses. She started me on aggressive supportive care, explaining I'd need constant monitoring over the next week to watch for kidney failure, liver damage, or respiratory distress, as my body tried to eliminate the toxin. My parents announced they were driving down from Sacramento after hearing about the arrest on the news. The stress of nearly losing me had made them realize how much time they'd wasted on minor family disputes, and they wanted to be here for whatever came next. They arrived 6 hours later with overnight bags and coffee for the nurses, setting up camp in my hospital room like they planned to stay until I was completely recovered. A woman named Jennifer Walsh from the district attorney's office arrived the next morning, pulling up a chair beside my hospital bed to take my statement about everything that had happened over the past 4 months. She was writing quickly while I described the symptoms I'd been experiencing, shrees, the weight loss and stomach cramps I'd attributed to wedding stress, and how my fiancé had insisted on cooking all my meals since we'd moved in together. Jennifer said she was pursuing charges for attempted murder in the first degree, plus poisoning, fraud, and assault with a deadly weapon for the crystal vase incident. With all the evidence and witnesses from the engagement party, she felt confident about securing a conviction that would put him away for decades. The engagement photographer knocked on the door then, carrying a camera bag and explaining he'd captured everything on video from my sister's tackle through my fiancé's hostage attempt. Detective Santos took the memory cards as evidence, saying the footage would be crucial for showing the jury exactly what happened and proving my sister was trying to save my life, not just causing chaos. A man in an expensive suit introduced himself as David Park, saying he represented my sister and needed to discuss defense strategy for the assault charges she was facing. My sister told him she didn't want any defense that claimed temporary insanity or emotional distress, because she knew exactly what she was doing and would tackle him again if it meant saving my life. David kept suggesting necessity defense given the imminent threat to my life, but my sister shook her head and said she'd rather go to jail than pretend she was sorry for stopping an attempted murder. Dr. Chen returned with more test results, this time from tissue samples they'd taken, and her face was serious as she showed us the cellular damage patterns. The ricin exposure in my body went back 4 months, starting with small amounts and gradually increasing, proving my fiancé had been systematically poisoning me just like my sister claimed. The timeline matched perfectly with when we'd moved in together and he'd started preparing all my meals, showing clear premeditation and careful calculation of doses. Each test showed progressively more cellular damage, with notes about which samples corresponded to which timeframes, creating a perfect record of attempted murder. Dr. Chen said this kind of evidence was unusual because most ricin victims didn't survive long enough for comprehensive testing, but my sister's intervention had saved not just my life, but also preserved crucial proof. My hands shook worse as the reality hit me that the man I'd planned to marry had been slowly killing me for months, carefully increasing doses while pretending to care about my health and wedding planning stress. Detective Santos took photographs of all the test results and said this evidence, combined with the journal my sister found, would make it impossible for my fiancé to claim the poisoning was accidental or unintentional. She was building a case that would ensure he never got out of prison, and she promised he'd never be able to hurt me or anyone else again. The next morning, Detective Santos called to say they'd arrested the friend who'd helped my fiancé learn about ricin extraction. Michael Torres worked at a chemical supply company and had provided the castor beans and processing equipment in exchange for a cut of my inheritance money. He tried to flee when police arrived at his workplace but got caught in the parking lot, and now he was sitting in jail with a lawyer advising him to stay silent. The investigation had traced cryptocurrency payments from my fiancé to Michael, plus hundreds of text messages discussing extraction methods and dosing schedules to make my death look like natural organ failure. My fiancé was formally charged with attempted murder in the first degree 2 days later, along with poisoning, fraud, and assault with a deadly weapon for the crystal vase incident. His lawyer tried to arrange bail, but the judge reviewed the evidence and declared him a flight risk, especially given the booked flights to the Cayman Islands and the offshore accounts. The courtroom was packed with engagement party guests who'd come to watch, and my fiancé sat in his orange jumpsuit staring at me like this was somehow my fault for not dying quietly. After a week in the hospital, they finally discharged me with strict instructions to return daily for monitoring as my body continued processing the ricin. My hands still shook uncontrollably. And I kept losing weight despite eating everything the nutritionist recommended. But Dr. Chen said these symptoms should improve as the toxin cleared my system completely. The insurance company called while I was paying up my hospital room, explaining that the $8 million policy my fiancé had taken out was void due to fraud and attempted murder, and they were adding insurance fraud to his growing list of charges. My sister got charged with assault and destruction of property for the engagement party incident, but Jennifer from the DA's office recommended minimal charges since she'd prevented a murder. The judge agreed to community service and probation instead of jail time, saying my sister's actions were justified given the immediate threat to my life and the failure of the police to act on her initial report. The media discovered our story when the arrest records became public, and suddenly our engagement party disaster was featured on every local news station, with reporters camping outside my apartment building. We had to hire a crisis management firm to handle media requests and keep journalists from following me to my medical appointments or bothering our family members for interviews. The venue sent us a bill for $15,000 in damages from the destroyed dessert table and trampled landscaping, but they withdrew it immediately when our publicist explained the full circumstances. The venue owner actually called to apologize for not recognizing the signs of abuse and offered to host a recovery celebration dinner, free of charge, if I wanted one. 4 different party guests contacted Detective Santos, saying they'd noticed my fiancé acting strangely around my food and drinks at previous social gatherings over the past year. My cousin Jake felt terrible for initially defending my fiancé and spent hours on the phone apologizing for not seeing through his manipulation sooner. One bridesmaid broke down crying when she admitted noticing my dramatic weight loss months earlier, but assuming it was intentional for wedding photos. And now she couldn't forgive herself for not speaking up. Detective Santos found my fiancé's computer and discovered he'd researched ricin poisoning symptoms and lethal dosages hundreds of times over the past 6 months. He'd also been studying inheritance law, offshore banking procedures, and countries without extradition treaties, bookmarking articles about fleeing prosecution and living under assumed identities after committing serious crimes. The financial investigation revealed he'd stolen over $60,000 from my accounts in small increments I hadn't noticed because the ricin was affecting my cognitive function. He'd also applied for 7 credit cards in my name without permission, running up $35,000 in debt, buying luxury items he could liquidate for cash after my death. Detective Santos said each new piece of evidence strengthened the case exponentially, and with everything they had now, he was looking at life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Michael Torres's lawyer contacted Jennifer Walsh about a cooperation deal, saying his client would testify against my fiancé in exchange for reduced charges since he'd only provided materials and expertise, not administered the poison directly. Jennifer said they'd probably accept the deal because his testimony about the planning stages would guarantee conviction, even though she personally wanted both men to spend their lives in prison. My parents had to change their phone numbers and install security systems after reporters kept calling and showing up at their house trying to get exclusive interviews. The story went viral on social media, with people debating whether my sister was a hero or a vigilante, though the overwhelming majority supported her actions given the circumstances. My fiancé's family tried to visit him in jail, but he refused all contact, probably because he knew they'd realize his guilt once they heard the evidence against him. His mother sent a letter through her attorney, claiming I'd driven her son to desperate measures by flaunting my family's wealth. But I returned it unopened. The fire marshal completed his investigation of the party incident and officially ruled my sister's actions as justified emergency intervention to prevent imminent death. This classification helped her legal case significantly since it demonstrated her response was proportionate to the threat level, not random violence or personal revenge. More evidence kept surfacing as Detective Santos expanded her investigation, including receipts for chemistry equipment hidden in my fiancé's storage unit, along with detailed notes about ricin synthesis and delivery methods. She also discovered draft emails he'd never sent, outlining plans to play the grieving widower while my family's trust fund transferred to him as my surviving spouse. The hospital connected me with Dr. Amanda Foster, a therapist who specialized in helping people recover from attempted murder by intimate partners. Her office had warm lighting and comfortable chairs, plus a box of tissues within reach of every seat, which made sense once we started talking. Dr. Foster asked me to describe our entire relationship from the beginning, and I started recognizing manipulation tactics I'd completely missed. My fiancé had isolated me from friends who questioned our rapid engagement, convinced me to combine our finances within weeks of moving in together, and made me feel crazy whenever I questioned his behavior or mood changes. She explained how abusers systematically break down their victims' independence and self-trust before escalating to physical harm, making poisoning just the final step in months of psychological conditioning. While I was processing this in therapy, my fiancé's family sent another letter through their lawyer that made me physically sick. They weren't apologizing for their son's attempt to murder me. They were angry about the damage to their family's reputation and wanted me to publicly forgive him to help their social standing. His mother wrote that if I'd been more generous with my trust fund money, her son wouldn't have felt pressured into such desperate measures, essentially blaming me for forcing him to try poisoning me for my inheritance. The letter included a request for a meeting to discuss how I could help repair their family's image in the community. I had my attorney send them a cease and desist order threatening legal action if they contacted me again. Captain Rodriguez from the county sheriff's office visited my apartment with his final report 6 weeks after the engagement party. He'd spent considerable time interviewing witnesses, reviewing the evidence my sister had gathered, and reconstructing the timeline of events leading to that night. His official determination was that my sister's actions constituted lawful prevention of imminent murder. The report specifically noted that with law enforcement initially dismissing her concerns and the final ricin dose about to be administered, disrupting the party was the only viable way to save my life. This ruling was crucial for my sister's defense, since it established that she wasn't just acting emotionally, but making a rational decision to prevent my death. David Park, my sister's attorney, said this report would likely result in all charges being dropped or reduced to minor infractions with community service. During my next appointment, Dr. Chen reviewed my latest test results with a cautiously optimistic expression. The positive news was that my ricin levels were decreasing and my organ function was slowly improving, but she warned that ricin exposure could cause long-term effects that might not manifest for months or years. My hands would probably always have a slight tremor, especially during stress, and some cognitive effects might persist, including difficulty concentrating and memory problems. She emphasized that I was incredibly fortunate my sister intervened when she did, because another few doses would have caused irreversible organ damage and certain death. The tremor in my hands intensified as she spoke, and I realized I'd carry physical reminders of my fiancé's betrayal for the rest of my life. The grand jury convened 2 months after the engagement party, and Jennifer Walsh presented the comprehensive case they'd built. Beyond the attempted murder and poisoning charges, investigators had uncovered extensive financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges related to his partnership with Michael Torres. The grand jury indicted my fiancé on 19 separate counts, including attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated assault, identity theft, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple fraud charges. His attorney attempted to negotiate a plea bargain for 20 years, but Jennifer refused any deal, offering less than life imprisonment. She told me privately that she wanted him locked away permanently so he could never hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt me. My sister stopped by one evening while my parents were visiting, and we sat in my living room where I'd planned wedding details just months earlier. She finally told me everything about that night. She broke into his apartment, how she'd found the journal hidden behind textbooks, with detailed notes about my deteriorating health and calculations for the final lethal dose. She tried calling me multiple times, but my fiancé had blocked her number on my phone without my knowledge. Going to the police at midnight was her desperate attempt to get official help before it was too late. When they dismissed her concerns due to lack of probable cause, she realized she had only hours to save my life before the engagement party dinner killed me. Disrupting the party was the only plan she could think of that would prevent me from consuming the final dose while exposing his crimes to multiple witnesses simultaneously. We both cried as I thanked her for sacrificing her own freedom and reputation to save my life. The corrupt officials who'd initially dismissed my sister's evidence faced their own legal consequences when Internal Affairs investigated their handling of the case. Detective James Murphy, who'd refused to take my sister's report seriously, was suspended pending investigation for negligent endangerment. The department found that he'd failed to follow proper protocols for investigating potential poisoning cases and had dismissed credible evidence without adequate investigation. His 25-year career ended with forced retirement and loss of pension benefits, though many people felt he deserved criminal charges for nearly letting me die. I returned to work part-time after 4 months, but the cognitive effects of ricin exposure made concentration extremely difficult. My hands shook when I tried to type, and I'd forget important details mid-conversation, requiring frequent breaks and simplified task assignments. My supervisor was understanding and arranged for me to work from home most days with flexible schedules. Sitting at my desk, trying to focus on financial reports, while my hands trembled, made me wonder if I'd ever feel mentally sharp again. Michael Torres finally accepted a cooperation deal when faced with life imprisonment for conspiracy to commit murder. His attorney contacted Jennifer saying he'd provide complete testimony about the planning stages in exchange for 15 years instead of life. He had detailed records of every conversation about ricin extraction, timing discussions, and plans for disposing of evidence after my death. Text messages showed my fiancé asking specific questions about dosage calculations and how to make ricin poisoning look like natural organ failure. With his testimony, the prosecution's case became virtually unbeatable. My parents surprised me by announcing they were renewing their marriage vows on the anniversary of the engagement party. The stress of nearly losing me had reminded them what really mattered, and they wanted to celebrate their commitment after 30 years together. They planned a small ceremony in their backyard with just immediate family, the exact opposite of the elaborate wedding I'd been planning before discovering my fiancé was trying to murder me. Watching them exchange simple gold bands while my sister cried happy tears felt like healing after so much trauma and betrayal. Detective Santos called me the morning before the trial was scheduled to begin, her voice tense with a new development they'd uncovered. She'd obtained a warrant for my fiancé's safety deposit box and found additional vials of ricin, plus detailed maps of my family's properties and schedules for other family members. He'd apparently been planning to eliminate other potential heirs to my grandmother's trust fund, starting with my sister, who'd been most suspicious of our relationship. The box also contained fake identification documents and cash, confirming his plans to flee the country after completing his murder scheme. I vomited when she told me about the photographs he'd taken of my nephew's school and playground, indicating he'd been planning to kill a 7-year-old child to inherit more money. My sister was placed in protective custody immediately when they realized she'd been his next target, and additional charges were filed for conspiracy to commit multiple murders. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with jury selection taking 4 days due to extensive media coverage and the shocking nature of the evidence. Potential jurors had to be questioned individually about their knowledge of ricin poisoning and whether they could remain impartial after seeing news reports about the engagement party incident. The judge ultimately brought in jurors from 3 counties away to find people who hadn't formed strong opinions about the case. Seeing my fiancé in court for the first time since that night made my entire body shake uncontrollably, and I had to leave the courtroom twice to compose myself in the bathroom. He'd lost significant weight in jail and looked pale and gaunt, but his eyes still held the same cold calculation I'd seen when he pressed that crystal vase against my throat. I testified for 4 days straight, describing every symptom I'd ignored, every lie I'd believed, and every meal he'd prepared while slowly killing me. His defense attorney tried to portray me as a paranoid rich girl who'd imagined threats that didn't exist, but the medical evidence spoke for itself. She questioned why I hadn't noticed my declining health or the missing money, trying to make me appear negligent or stupid. I explained how ricin affects cognitive function, making victims confused and unable to think clearly, which was exactly why he'd chosen that particular poison. When I described the moment he grabbed me with the crystal vase and threatened to finish killing me, several jurors looked visibly shaken, and one man had to wipe tears from his eyes. My sister testified next, still carrying guilt about the destroyed engagement party, even though everyone knew she'd saved my life. She broke down completely when the prosecutor displayed photos of the ricin vials and murder plans they'd found in his safety deposit box, reading aloud from his journal entries, where he'd calculated my family's net worth and planned to eliminate multiple relatives, left the courtroom completely silent, except for her sobbing. She testified about discovering the evidence, attempting to get police intervention, and making the desperate decision to disrupt the party when no one would listen to her warnings. Even the judge appeared moved when my sister described watching me deteriorate for months while being unable to convince anyone that something was wrong. Michael Torres testified as part of his cooperation agreement, looking ashamed as he admitted to providing ricin extraction equipment and expertise in exchange for promised payments from my inheritance. He confirmed every detail about the planning stages, showing text messages where my fiancé had asked specific questions about lethal dosages and undetectable delivery methods. My fiancé stared at him with pure hatred throughout the testimony, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Torres admitted he'd known the plan was to murder me, but needed money for his own gambling debts, making him equally responsible for nearly ending my life. The defense attempted to argue temporary insanity caused by financial pressure and gambling addiction, bringing in experts who discussed stress-induced mental breaks. However, their own witnesses had to acknowledge that the months of planning, detailed journal entries, and backup murder plans demonstrated clear premeditation and understanding of right from wrong. The journal evidence was particularly damaging, showing systematic research into my family's wealth, careful dosage calculations, and contingency plans for eliminating other potential heirs. After 6 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 19 counts, including attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit multiple murders, and extensive fraud charges. My fiancé showed no reaction to the verdicts, just sat there staring straight ahead like he'd expected this outcome all along. His mother started screaming from the gallery that I'd destroyed an innocent man and ruined their family's reputation with my accusations. At sentencing 2 weeks later, I delivered my victim impact statement with my voice trembling as I described how he'd stolen my ability to trust anyone, my physical health, and my sense of safety in my own home. I told the court about the ongoing medical treatment, the permanent tremor in my hands, and the nightmares where I wake up feeling poison burning through my veins. The judge listened intently, then sentenced my fiancé to life in prison without possibility of parole, calling it one of the most calculated and heartless attempted murders in his 30 years on the bench. 1 month after sentencing, Michael Torres received his agreed-upon sentence of 15 years with possibility of parole after 10, plus permanent loss of his chemical handling licenses and restitution payments for all my medical expenses. Detective Murphy's internal affairs investigation concluded with his termination from the sheriff's department, loss of pension benefits, and a recommendation for criminal negligence charges that were ultimately dropped. My sister's community service assignment turned out to be teaching self-defense classes at the local women's shelter, helping other domestic violence survivors learn to protect themselves. She discovered a talent for empowering other women and eventually became a certified instructor, turning her trauma into purpose by helping others recognize and escape dangerous relationships. The restraining order against my fiancé's family was made permanent after they violated the original order by hiring a private investigator to follow me and attempting to contact my employer. Their attorney informed them that any further harassment would result in criminal stalking charges and potential jail time for the entire family. 6 months after the trial, I started dating again, meeting David through the survivor support group that met weekly at the community center. He was there because his ex-wife had tried to poison him with antifreeze, so he understood why I checked my food obsessively and flinched when people moved too quickly around me. We took everything incredibly slowly, dating for 8 months before he even spent the night at my apartment, both of us recognizing the importance of rebuilding trust gradually. My health continued improving steadily, though Dr. Chen warned that some effects might be permanent reminders of how close I'd come to death. My hands still shake during stressful situations, and I have digestive issues that flare up unpredictably, but my cognitive function has mostly returned to normal. The tremor serves as a constant reminder of my fiancé's betrayal, but also of my sister's courage in saving my life when no one else would listen to her concerns. 1 year after the engagement party, my sister and I visited the venue where it all happened, now completely renovated with new landscaping and a different layout. We stood where the dessert table had been, remembering that chaotic night when she'd tackled my fiancé into the cake and chocolate fountain to save my life. The venue owner approached us and quietly said he'd installed new security systems and staff training protocols for recognizing domestic violence situations, hoping to prevent anyone else from going through what we'd experienced. David and I got married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at the courthouse with just our immediate families present, both of us agreeing that elaborate celebrations weren't worth the stress or attention. My wedding dress was a simple white sundress from a department store, and we exchanged plain gold bands instead of expensive jewelry that might attract unwanted notice. The entire ceremony lasted 15 minutes, but it felt more meaningful than any elaborate party could have been. My sister served as my maid of honor, and during her toast at our small reception dinner, she said she'd always be grateful for that terrible night that taught us both the true meaning of family loyalty and sacrifice. We started a foundation using the money recovered from my fiancé's fraud schemes, focusing on domestic violence prevention and education about poisoning as a form of abuse. The foundation funds research into detecting various toxins in domestic situations and provides legal assistance to survivors of attempted murder by intimate partners. My sister quit her corporate job to run the foundation full-time, finding her calling in helping other families recognize and escape dangerous relationships before it's too late. The foundation we established grew beyond our wildest expectations, receiving donations from families who'd experienced similar situations and grants from organizations focused on domestic violence prevention. Within 3 years, we'd opened offices in 12 states and helped prosecute over 200 cases of intimate partner poisoning that might have gone undetected without our educational programs and testing protocols. My sister became a nationally recognized expert on toxicology in domestic violence cases, testifying before Congress about the need for mandatory reporting requirements and enhanced detection methods in emergency rooms across the country. The media attention around our case led to several documentaries and true crime podcasts, with producers constantly requesting interviews about that night at the engagement party when everything changed. We agreed to participate in one major documentary about domestic violence poisoning, hoping our story might help other victims recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Watching actors recreate that chaotic scene where my sister tackled my fiancé into the dessert table felt surreal, but we knew the visibility could save lives by educating people about this hidden form of abuse. Dr. Chen published a medical journal article about my case, detailing the progression of ricin poisoning symptoms and the importance of early intervention, which became required reading in toxicology programs nationwide. She used my medical records and test results to create diagnostic criteria that helped other doctors identify similar cases in their emergency rooms. The article won several awards and led to improved testing protocols that could detect ricin exposure within hours instead of days, potentially saving countless lives. My nephew, who was 7 when my fiancé photographed his school as part of his murder plan, is now 12 and knows the basic story of why Uncle Bad Guy went to prison forever. We've been careful to explain it in age-appropriate terms, focusing on how Aunt Sarah saved Mommy and how families protect each other no matter what. He's proud to tell his friends that his aunt is famous for stopping a bad person, though he doesn't understand the full horrific details yet. The anniversary of the engagement party became a strange kind of family holiday where we gather each year to celebrate life and the bonds that hold us together through the worst circumstances. Last year, we had 30 people at my parents' house, including David's family, several members of my support group, and Detective Santos, who's become a close family friend. We toast with sparkling cider instead of champagne, and everyone shares something they're grateful for. But the underlying theme is always how precious and fragile life can be. My fiancé's appeals have been denied 3 times now, with each court upholding his life sentence and rejecting claims of ineffective counsel or prosecutorial misconduct. His mother still sends letters through attorneys every few years, alternately blaming me for ruining their family and begging for forgiveness. But I've stopped reading them entirely. The last I heard, she'd moved to Florida to escape the stigma of having a son convicted of attempted murder, but she continues to maintain his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence. The women's shelter where my sister teaches self-defense classes named their main training room after her, with a plaque reading, "The Sarah Martinez Center for Survivor Empowerment." She's helped train over 3,000 women in personal safety and recognizing abuse patterns, many of whom credit her classes with giving them the confidence to leave dangerous relationships before violence escalated to attempted murder. David and I bought a house last year in the same neighborhood where I grew up, close enough to my family for regular dinners, but far enough away for privacy and independence. The kitchen has excellent ventilation and an open layout where I can see everything being prepared, which helps with the anxiety I still feel around food preparation. We grow our own vegetables in raised beds in the backyard, giving me complete control over what we eat, while providing therapeutic benefits from working with soil and plants. My cognitive function has mostly returned to normal, though I still have days when concentration is difficult and my memory feels foggy around the edges. Dr. F. Chen says this is likely permanent damage from the months of ricin exposure, but compared to being dead, a little mental fog seems like a small price to pay. I've learned to write everything down, keep detailed calendars, and ask for clarification when things don't make sense. Accommodations that help me function normally in both work and personal situations. The tremor in my hands has actually improved over the years, and it's becoming barely noticeable, except during times of extreme stress or when I'm particularly tired. Physical therapy and meditation have helped significantly, along with occupational therapy that taught me adaptive strategies for tasks that require fine motor control. Most people don't notice it anymore unless I point it out, but I can always feel it as a reminder of how close I came to losing everything. Michael Torres was released on parole after serving 8 years of his 15-year sentence, immediately moving to another state and changing his name to avoid media attention and death threats from people who'd followed our case. Detective Santos keeps tabs on him through law enforcement networks, and he's apparently working in construction under his new identity, staying out of trouble and fulfilling his parole requirements. Part of me wonders if he has nightmares about helping someone plan multiple murders, but mostly I try not to think about him at all. The detective who initially dismissed my sister's evidence, James Murphy, never found work in law enforcement again after his termination and pension loss. He ended up working security at a shopping mall, a dramatic fall from his position as a senior detective, and reportedly struggled with alcohol problems and depression. While I don't wish suffering on anyone, His negligence nearly cost me my life, and the consequences he faced seem appropriate given the seriousness of his failure to protect a citizen reporting credible threats. My parents renewed their vows again on their 35th anniversary, this time in Hawaii with their children and grandchildren present. A celebration of survival and family bonds that felt joyful rather than desperate. They've become advocates for family communication and supporting relatives who report concerns about domestic violence, speaking at community events about the importance of believing victims even when their claims seem unlikely or inconvenient. David and I tried having children for 2 years before learning that the ricin exposure had damaged my reproductive system, making natural conception extremely unlikely despite my overall recovery. We've discussed adoption and fertility treatments, but for now, we're content being the fun aunt and uncle to my nephew and David's nieces, spoiling them with adventures and presents while enjoying the freedom to travel and focus on the foundation's expanding work. The engagement ring that my fiancé gave me, worth nearly $50,000, was sold at auction with the proceeds going to our foundation after the criminal case concluded. I couldn't bear to wear it or even look at it after learning how he'd probably bought it with money stolen from my accounts. But turning it into resources for other survivors felt like the perfect transformation of something evil into something helpful. 5 years have passed since my sister destroyed my engagement party to save my life, and not a day goes by that I don't feel grateful for her courage and quick thinking. My life is full of people who genuinely care about my well-being and want me to be happy and safe, which turned out to be everything I actually needed all along. The tremor in my hands reminds me daily how close I came to death, but also how lucky I am to have survived with a sister willing to sacrifice everything to protect me.